Mr. Chairman. I noticed there's a lot of similarities in the elements of stalking, albeit it's a felony, with 189111 harassment. Does this statute in any way diminish the peace officer's ability to make the decision to charge under harassment if the circumstances warrant? One of the examples is makes repeated communications, follows somebody around in a public place that are similar between the two. And I'm just saying that if an officer has discretion to make an arrest with harassment as opposed to stalking, does this change in the statute of stalking diminish that discretion?
Mr. Chairman. Representative Barker, no, it does not. It still gives the police officer that discretion to charge whatever they feel is appropriate, whatever they have probable cause to believe with the suspect, whatever crime the suspect committed. So it does not take away that discretion.
Mr. Turner, I have an observation and a question. And this is where my brother is one single member of this committee. You have a hurdle with me. You've got to overcome. I don't know what I'm going to do about this bill. We often know exactly what we're going to do when we walk through that door. But I see the pros and cons of this. Let me tell you what the hurdle is. Some years ago in domestic violence, we essentially made arrests mandatory. And in its operation, as important as that was, we basically took away all discretion from the responding officer. And it doesn't work all that well. I mean, it works on the one end of the spectrum extremely well. The trouble is it just ends up with a lot more arrests than they really ought to have. And so that's your hurdle here. I get, and for members of the audience that are here, I get what a tragedy this was, and I'm astounded that there was not an arrest and that someone was held in jail, and you know, we need to do what we can in creating the structure and the context and the legal regime for those things to occur, but I don't want to create one more mandatory arrest situation in which every sort of accusation of stalking, the officer in that situation says, I'm stalking, I'm charging stalking, I now have to make an arrest. I think we'll overcompensate. That's what legislative solutions tend to do. So can you tell me, as an advocate for this, how is this bill different from domestic violence, the domestic violence arrest? Is it different? How are we going to not just have one more situation where basically law enforcement opts for the safe course, the one without discretion, and says, okay, I'm going to arrest, and that's what it is? Please.
Thank you. Well, one thing about this is a lot of times this happens already. In a lot of the larger jurisdictions, Colorado Springs, for example, where they have 20 or 30 judges and magistrates, many judicial resources, it is very common for anybody who is arrested for a felony, they have to go before a judge anyway before they can bond out. So in many crimes, you know, this happens anyway. But unfortunately, in smaller jurisdictions where there aren't those resources, where there's not a full-time judge on duty 24/7, they don't have that opportunity. And I understand where the chair says, you know, sometimes mandatory arrest doesn't work all that well. I would contend a couple of things. First of all, in my opinion, and I think statistics bear this out, a lot of times stalking is actually more dangerous than domestic violence. And the reason is because in domestic violence, you typically have some type of consensual contact. And regardless, based on the definition, you're going to have, at a minimum, an intimate relationship involved. Like I said, in 75% of the time, that is not true for stalking cases. So you're giving that protection to domestic violence victims, but not to stalking cases. The other point is that sometimes in domestic violence cases, usually in domestic violence cases, where the mandatory arrest comes into play is that it's immediate. It's on scene. A neighbor calls the police because they hear an argument. A spouse calls the police because there is an argument. Police arrive, here's what happens, boom, there's a mandatory arrest. Sometimes that will happen in stalking cases, in a situation where the suspect is standing outside the victim's door, for example. A lot of times it will not, because if it's a situation where he's been following me for 3 months, he's been calling me for 3 months, whatever the case may be, police are going to have to do some additional investigation. A lot of times the arrest is not an immediate situation. But again, what this does is it still gives them that discretion, immediate arrest or an arrest warrant. Simply what it does is it takes out the option of filling out a piece of paper saying, here you go, appear in court 6 months or 6 weeks later, without giving the victims or the district attorney's office a chance to express their concerns to the judge about what bond should be, what the history is between this suspect and this victim. So I think that's the important part of this and where it kind of differs from the mandatory arrest in domestic violence between stalking.